and disciplined enough and talent enough and nerve enough to step into the light when it turned in our direction and just smile a while. This presentation is an attempt to join theologian Anthony B. Penn in doing theology in non-traditional ways. While Penn was specifically referring to overlooked dimensions of African American life and Black theology, I believe it can also refer to considering the theologies of non-Abrahamic religious traditions. Indeed, this is in line with Penn's own project when he writes, quote, "While Black and womanist theologies assume a limited range of religious orientations and creedal formulations, I continue to be concerned with religious pluralism, marking African American communities," end quote. As I am myself both Black, clearly, and religious, this is an endeavor that is particularly pertinent to me. If Abrahamic theologies are the only context in which to consider Black and African American life, then I am excluded. If I and people like me are to be included, then we must take Penn's concern with religious pluralism seriously. This paper seeks to examine, then, the writings of Nichiren Daishonin, a 13th century Buddhist monk, and his liturgical recommendations in order to develop what it means to be Buddhistically human from his perspective. In other words, I seek to construct Nichiren Daishonin's theological anthropology. For Nichiren, the human being is Buddha in the world and has an innate potential to express Buddhahood. One primary symbol, the Gohonzon, manifests this potential, and suffering is the result of an innate capacity for hellish experiences due to a kind of ignorance known as fundamental darkness. Further, I will use both Jennifer Aaron Bestie's work on trauma theory as a challenge to Rana's theology of grace, and M. Sean Copeland's notion of liturgy of the spirit, to show that Nichiren's theological anthropology is concretized in the liturgical practice known as Gongyo, that he recommended his followers engage in, and that Nichiren gives sufficient attention to suffering and healing, thereby avoiding the charge of having too positive a theology. Nichiren Daishonin was a Japanese Buddhist monk, ordained initially in the Tendai school. He publicly broke with that tradition when he established his own teaching of devotion to the Sattdharma Pundarika Sutra, or the Sutra on the Lotus Blossom of the Wonderful Law, also known as the Lotus Sutra. The school of Buddhism that he founded is known as the Nichiren Shu, or the Nichiren School. And Nichiren taught that the best way to express devotion to the teachings contained in the Lotus Sutra was to chant its title in the form of a mantra, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. About the human person, Nichiren wrote, "First of all, as to the question of where exactly hell and the Buddha exist, one sutra states that hell exists underground, and another states that the Buddha is in the West. Closer examination, however, reveals that both exist in our 5-foot bodies. The Buddha dwells within our hearts. Therefore, this self has from the beginning been in possession of one's own realm of Buddhahood. Therefore, when one attains Buddhahood, one does not take on some new or other Buddha identity." As Miguel Diaz makes clear in On Being Human, the central notion of the human person for Karl Rahner is the human person as spirit in the world. For Nichiren, it is undoubtedly that the human person is Buddha in the world. And as such, rather than thinking of the Buddha as a transcendent being, or Buddhahood as a transcendent principle beyond human beings, Nichiren considers Buddhahood to be the very nature of the human person. Discussing Rahner's theology of symbol, Diaz wrote that according to Rahner, quote, "A symbol reveals the thing symbolized and is itself full of the thing symbolized, being its concrete form of existence," end quote. And he adds that symbols highlight the potential of created reality and of human realities in particular to mediate an experience of the sacred. And in a sense, then, a symbol can enable one to express oneself in the world. For Nichiren, then, the primary symbol is the Gohonzon. Traditionally, you never depict the Gohonzon, so that's not the Gohonzon, that's just Nichiren himself. Google it. Anyway, so Nichiren's primary symbol, then, is the Gohonzon. And Gohonzon is a Japanese word that means honored object of worship. As an object of worship, the Gohonzon is a mandala in the form of a calligraphic scroll, and typically takes the form of a painting, scroll, or statue on which is depicted an awakened vision of the person and the world. As a symbol, the Gohonzon is in line with what Diaz, quoting Goizueta, defines as an, quote, an object, image, or action that reveals, mediates, and makes present what may be called the ineffable, the holy, the sacred, or the supernatural, end quote. Here, the created reality is the inscribed Gohonzon, and the experience of the sacred is Buddhahood. For Nichiren, the Gohonzon he inscribed for his followers serves as a primary symbol for awakened reality. It serves as a visual depiction of the principle of Buddhahood. And Nichiren makes clear that by possessing this Gohonzon, one can experience the state of Buddhahood in their lives, which is ordinarily hidden. But this begs then two questions that many of you may be asking, as I ask myself. Why then is there a need for the Gohonzon? Why is there a need for a symbol? And why is the world of Buddhahood then hidden from our ordinary experience? And to answer this question then, we must examine the principle of ignorance in Buddhism. In God and the Victim, Traumatic Intrusions on Grace and Freedom, Jennifer Erin Bestie discusses trauma theory and the ways in which it challenges Carl Rahner's conception of selfhood and freedom. Briefly, traumahood is defined by Dr. Susanna Radstone as, quote, including both work around the experience of survivors of the Holocaust and other catastrophic personal and collective experiences, and the theoretical and methodological innovations that might derive from this work, end quote. When considered in the light of trauma theory, Bestie sees an issue with the lack of attention in Rahner's work to how grace is mediated. And she notes that traumatic experiences such as rape and incest and questions if and how grace is mediated in such situations. And she makes clear that such experiences do not mediate grace, and that only nurturing conditions do. Her conclusion is that a revised Rahnerian account of freedom and grace, quote, emphasizes that our main task is to ensure that we and our neighbors have sufficient conditions that enable us to realize our freedom and live out a yes to God, end quote. In constructing Nichiren Daishonen's theological anthropology on the basis of Rahnerian grace and symbol, we must then address whether Nichiren Daishonen's conception of the person as Buddha in the world sufficiently addresses experiences of brokenness. And in answering this question, then, we can turn to Nichiren's phenomenological understanding of hell and Buddhahood. And recall that for Nichiren, both hell and Buddhahood are phenomenological states that a person experiences within themselves. Adhering to this understanding, Nichiren affirmed, as do all Buddhist sects, the reality of suffering and hellish experiences. And the term that's often used for suffering in Buddhism is dukkha. But suffering is not quite it. I guess good enough. It'll do for the Gethin's book, Introduction to Buddhism or something. But that's not really the sense of dukkha. Right? Du means bad. Ka means a space. So dukkha means then to be in a bad space. And what it really means is this persistent feeling of existential angst, that feeling of never quite rightness that we have in life. Right? That is dukkha. And for Nichiren, right, this dukkha then is propelled by karma, which is the accumulated intentional actions of body, speech, and mind and their effects. While Nichiren held to the basic understanding of this model in Buddhism, he located the origin of dukkha and the hellish experiences that comprise it elsewhere. To Nichiren, the root issue was a kind of ignorance that he termed fundamental darkness, or ignorance to the true nature of life. And if you recall, the true nature of life, of a person's life, according to Nichiren, is Buddhahood, that they are Buddha in the world. Ignorance of this fact then causes beings to suffer and inflicts suffering on others. As Nichiren wrote to a follower, enlightenment means enlightenment to the essential nature of phenomena, and delusion, ignorance of it. One should discard the ignorance associated with evil and delusion, and take as one's basis the awakening that is characterized by goodness and enlightenment, end quote. In other words, the essential nature of the human person is innate Buddhahood, and delusion, or fundamental darkness, is ignorance to this fact. Nichiren would say that the kinds of suffering inflicted on others that Bestie addresses, such as the perpetrators of incest and abuse, is the result of the perpetrator's ignorance to their own innate Buddhahood and the innate Buddhahood of their victim. Nichiren would further consider any attempt to downplay and ignore victim experience as a manifestation of the ignorance to the victim's innate Buddhahood. While Nietzsche, of course, never addressed modern trauma theory, he was acutely aware of the sufferings inflicted upon his followers by various social, personal, and interpersonal forces, and his conviction was that this stemmed from the aforementioned fundamental darkness. The above exploration makes clear then that Nietzsche does indeed address experiences of brokenness and suffering in his writings. Understanding this, then, we can rely upon Nietzsche's explanation that hell and Buddhahood exist within the life of each person, and his attention to the root cause of suffering, namely ignorance to the innateness of Buddhahood, which he identified as fundamental darkness, to account for experiences of suffering and brokenness. In Nietzsche's theological anthropology, how then does the person move from brokenness or wholeness, right, from fundamental darkness to awakening to their innate Buddhahood, their true identity as Buddha in the world? For Nietzsche, then, the answer is liturgy. M. Sean Copeland points to the healing dimension of liturgy. Speaking of the experience of the enslaved and liturgical healing, she wrote, quote, "Still again, they risked abuse and assault to withdraw to secret places in woods and gullies, to commune with the supreme author of freedom. In resisting domination, the enslaved people nurtured a sense of themselves as subjects of freedom," end quote. This leads to healing. After slavery comes freedom and the opportunity to be and heal. Copeland shares, quote, "Freedom from enslavement was freedom for healing, for effective psychic healing and growth, for proper self-love, for loving flesh, for loving the body. The body is a site of divine revelation, and thus a basic human sacramental. So the freedom of the subject for love is enfleshed in the woman or man who consciously and intentionally, in word and in deed, assumes and affirms personhood and humanity," end quote. This freedom for love and healing leads to Copeland's notion of the liturgy of the spirit. Liturgy in practice for Copeland is the place where the heart is accepted and freedom is displayed. For Nietzsche, as for Copeland, liturgical practice enables a healing of the divide between brokenness and healing, between the Buddhahood, that is innate, and fundamental darkness, also innate. The liturgical practice that Nietzsche recommended for his followers was a practice known as gongyo. Gongyo means the assiduous practice and is the recitation of portions of the Lotus Sutra alongside the mantra of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. This practice is done in front of an enshrined Gohonzon. So chanting the mantra is the key to manifesting the full potential of the human person. By manifesting one's innate Buddhahood, there is also healing from experiences of suffering and brokenness. Nietzsche made this clear by explaining, quote, "When deluded, one is called an ordinary being, but when enlightened, one is called a Buddha. This is similar to a tarnished mirror that will shine like a jewel when polished. Arouse deep faith and diligently polish your mirror day and night. How should you polish it? Only by chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo to the Gohonzon," end quote. In this passage, Nietzsche calls the human person plagued by suffering and experiences of brokenness an ordinary being and likens their condition to that of a tarnished mirror. But as a tarnished mirror can be polished, so too can the human person. The liturgical practice performed in front of the Gohonzon is the way to polish the mirror and heal brokenness. In this paper, I set out to construct Nichiren Daishonin's theological anthropology. To do so, I utilized the language of Karl Rahner's notion of the human person as spirit in the world, and his theology of symbol in order to highlight analogous concepts in Nichiren's writings. The innateness of Buddhahood, rendering the person as Buddha in the world, and the inscription of the Gohonzon as the symbol which represents the full expression of this. I showed how Miguel Diaz's dialogue with themes found in Karl Rahner's work in the book On Being Human provided a model by which a similar dialogue could be had between Warnerian themes and Nietzsche. Specifically, Miguel Diaz's notion of the Hispanically human provided a guide for developing what it means to be Buddhistically human in Nietzsche's thought. To be Buddhistically human means to be awakened to and cognizant of innate Buddhahood. It also means acknowledging that the human person is sometimes asleep to this fact, and thus they suffer. Using Jennifer Bestie's work on trauma theory, we also saw that for Nietzsche, this falling short and this suffering is due to fundamental darkness. being ignorant to the Buddhahood that is innate. Finally, this paper examined the possibility for liturgical healing of trauma, brokenness, and suffering through an examination of the work of M. Sean Copeland. Copeland showed that through invocation of the Spirit and communion with the supreme author of freedom, slaves resisted and eventually found healing. This healing was described in the offering of the Liturgy of the Spirit. With this, we were able to look anew at Nichiren's prescribed liturgical practice of Gongyo, performed in front of the Gohonzon. And again, in Nichiren's teaching, Gongyo is the way in which the suffering and brokenness resulting from fundamental darkness is healed into the recognition of and actualization of Buddhahood. With this paper, I sought to join Anthony B. Penn in doing theology in non-traditional ways, and to contribute to understandings of religious pluralism by using Christian theology to look beyond to other kinds of theology. And in so doing, I hope to have contributed to and opened a new avenue in the study of Buddhist-Christian dialogue and Nichiren Daishonen's teachings by focusing on the study of liturgy therein. We are the ones you hoped would make you proud, because all of our work makes all of yours a part of something better, truer, deeper. Something that lights the way ahead like a lamp unto our feet, as steady as the unforgettable beats of our collective heart. We speak your names. We speak your names. Thank you.
Yes. Yes.